Hello, everyone. Welcome to yours and my favorite part of the week. That's right, it is your online Adolescent Psychology course, and I'm here to walk you through the hottest topics in biological transitions. Now, most of these lectures, I shoot for about an hour, but if we go over, what I do typically is just kind of highlight some slides that I'm not going to test on, because I'd rather go more in depth and then just kind of exclude some material for testing, so students can have the opportunity to learn more or less about specific topics that they're interested in. Okay, so with that said, let's jump into it. I forgot to mention, I am recording in my academic office, which has a very large fan and very poor lighting. So if you hear some annoying fan, that is what it is, and I can't really do anything about it. So anyway, let's jump into our first slides here. So beginning with this Bronfenbrenner, who's a famous developmental psychologist, and one who's, I would say, is very influential in this course. And basically one reason why we're going to kind of talk about different groups that aren't typically discussed in psychology, aka weird versus non-weird, which we talked about in the introduction video, is Bronfenbrenner. So let's review this theory real quick. He argued that scientists were studying human development out of context. Also, that development can vary wildly depending on the neighborhood, home environment, culture. He charged that developmental psychology has become the study of, quote-unquote, the strange behavior of children in strange situations with strange adults for the briefest possible periods of time. He argued that people are embedded in a series of environmental systems which interact with each other and the individual over time to influence development. Changes arise from ongoing transactions in which a changing organism and a changing environment affect one another. So basically, Bronfenbrenner's arguing is that you have to consider the context in which an individual is developing in. So we all grow up in different historical eras, I should say. We grow up in different kind of neighborhoods, different countries with different cultures, different levels of poverty, all kinds of different things that impact our developmental outcomes. And thus, kind of that little quote there is kind of critiquing a standard way of conducting psychological experiments. That is, we kind of bring people into a lab and then test people on like kind of what we believe as kind of like universal measures of certain psychological constructs, I should say. Basically, he's arguing, I'm not really sure how valid that is. It could be valid sometimes, but is it always valid? Because we live, again, in different cultures, different historical eras, and all these kind of things impact our developmental outcomes. Which brings us to his specific theory, that is the bioecological model of development. Some people have different kind of words or different terms for this model, but this is one of them. It is a model developed and proposed by Bronfenbrenner that points out that we must consider the developing person within the context of multiple environments. There are 5 broad systems called the microsystem, the exosystem, the macrosystem, the mesosystem, and the chronosystem. Bronfenbrenner argued that development will be complex because outcomes depend on many factors. For example, will a parent losing a job be detrimental to a child? Maybe. The historical period is important. The relationship between environments and people change over time. He became disenchanted with comparing children against each other and kind of universal outcomes, and instead proposed this idea of a PPCT model. That is, you need to consider the process, the person, the context, and time. Over the course of evolution and during individuals' development, genes and environments influence one another and act together to increase/decrease the probability of developmental outcomes. So now let's break this down a little bit. You can see on the right-hand side what I mean by these systems. In each kind of one of those circles is a system, and you can imagine in each one of those kind of systems there are particular environmental factors that impact development. Now, traditionally in the West, we really focus on kind of that microsystem, something like your individual personality, your genetics, stuff that's really thought to be like innate to a person, in a Western sense. That's kind of like the argument. But basically what he's arguing is no, it's not just those kind of things, and maybe even like your family. That's also kind of a traditional Western psychology way of looking at things. But it's not just those things. For example, your workplace impacts your development, your neighborhood you grew up in, the media, and then going even further out, your economy, your political system, your culture in your historical era. that you live in. So for example, going back to that question of will a parent losing a job be detrimental to a child? Well, maybe. Did you grow up in during the Great Depression? Well, you're probably a little more in trouble. Did you grow up before unemployment insurance existed, to the extent that we have any? Did you grow up before Social Security existed, Medicaid existed, Medicare existed? Those kind of historical era factors, you can see specific of those public policies impact development, because if I become unemployed and I have some kind of social safety net, I'm less likely to have negative outcomes. So there you go. You tell kind of historical era impacts people, or whatever. You're a woman in the early 1900s. You're excluded from most jobs. And say you get divorced, and there's much more stigma against divorce. Now it's the woman's, it's your fault. You're a woman. You've been labeled, blacklisted by society. You may be less likely to find even the limited jobs that have available to you. So again, what is the impact of divorce? It depends. And whatever, poverty, all these kind of things all impact our developmental outcomes. So it's very, very difficult in developmental psychology to say is one specific kind of risk factor associated with one specific outcome. Now, obviously, there are kind of obvious examples, like very, very extreme examples, but I'm just saying, in generally speaking, So I want you to think throughout this class, and this model is kind of emphasized of how kind of these larger systems come together to impact human development, and this is when culture comes in, and why the term project is very, very much centered around culture, kind of class, gender, all these kind of different variables that impact our developmental outcomes. And I would add finally that keep in mind that it's just not those systems, those environmental factors impacting us, but humans to varying extents depending on your ideology, impact those systems. We can theoretically change political systems. Political systems change throughout time. Economy, social conditions, culture, these things all change through time. So these systems and humans interacting with each other in complex ways to influence the development of these broader systems and at the same time influencing human outcomes. Some strengths and weaknesses of the Bronfenbrenner model. It conceptualizes development as a product of dynamic interactions between biological and environmental forces. Studies demonstrate that traumatic events can disrupt multiple systems. It considers the role of historical context in development. Some limitations include generalization problems. It depends / maybe. Do all developmental outcomes have the same degree? Maybe. How do we measure this? So what I mean by that second bullet point for strengths, for example, imagine a hurricane or some kind of natural disaster. Hey, COVID hits, right? And all of a sudden we have this new macro, even chrono historical stressor that exists. And it just, it doesn't just exist in a vacuum. It starts impacting other things in your life. It affects your community, how much you interact with your community. Things are closed down, so jobs are now kind of job opportunities are decreased. It may change culture. People change based on this. So you can have one basically big macro or chrono level event that then trickles down through all those more closer systems of development, all the way going back to your household or the self, which again is what we traditionally look at psychology, but you can see in those events of big kind of stressors, how they can impact and disrupt development, environmental factors of development across all those systems. Now, some limitations include, how do you measure this? Those are a lot of variables, and it's really not possible to measure all of them in a single study, but it is something to consider when kind of designing studies, and also kind of generalization problems. We do have to have psychology studies. The point is kind of predict outcomes. So how generalizable are studies? And that is just kind of an ongoing question. So now let's get into some specific course content beyond theory. Moving on to puberty, the main event, arguably, of adolescence. It's a period during which an individual becomes capable of sexual reproduction. More broadly, it includes all the physical changes that occurs in adolescence. There are dramatic increases in weight and height during puberty. Hormones regulated by the endocrine system contribute to physical changes. No new hormones are produced, and no new bodily systems are developed during puberty. So it's really not that something new just all of a sudden just comes out of nowhere, but rather kind of the amount of kind of certain hormones that we'll talk about momentarily, and kind of almost, this is not really exactly correct, but kind of coming online of certain biochemical processes which impact puberty, which we'll get to momentarily. There are two types of sex characteristics. The first, primary, that is a further development of sex glands, called gonads, that contribute to a series of hormonal shifts. And then secondary sex characteristics, which are characteristics not directly involved in reproduction. They include changes in genitals, breasts, and body hair. Now moving on to the endocrine system that we were kind of talking about a couple slides ago. It produces, circulates, and regulates hormone levels in the body. Thus, very important. Hormones are specialized substances secreted by endocrine glands. They travel through the blood. Glands are organs that stimulate particular parts of the body to respond in specific ways to specific hormones. The gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH, neurons, they are specialized neurons that are activated by pubertal hormones. So we have all kinds of hormones, not just puberty related, but you may be familiar with something called cortisol, that is also a hormone, stress related, not related to this directly, but there are a lot of hormones in the body. And like I said, they travel through the blood, so kind of slow moving compared to brain activities such as neurotransmitters, for example. Much more slow. Hormones are much more slower because they travel through the blood. There are glands, so that control particular production of hormones. One, which you probably have heard of before, the pituitary gland, which we'll cover momentarily. And then we have this GnRH neuron, which is basically a specific type of neuron related to puberty. It is activated. These neurons, I should say, respond to the presence of these puberty hormones being increasing throughout puberty. But let's get into some specifics with the most kind of common way that hormones interact, at least puberty related, that is. There are other axes. This one here is called the hormonal feedback loop, the HPG axis. You may be familiar with the HPA axis, that's related to stress, but here we have the HPG axis, and that stands for the hypothalamus pituitary gland gonad axis. The hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland. It has high concentrations of GnRH hormones. So within the hypothalamus, again, which controls the pituitary gland, it has a ton of those neurons specifically related to puberty, GnRH neurons. The pituitary gland controls hormones. It's referred to as the master gland. So this is the pituitary gland kind of like overseeing all kinds of other hormones, not just puberty related, but stress related, all kinds of other ones as well. But in this case here, really kind of overseeing the production of puberty related hormones. And then gonads, they are testes in males and ovaries in females, release sex hormones such as androgens and estrogens. It also, or I should say more specifically, the HPG axis is set to maintain certain levels of androgens and estrogens. When hormone levels fall below set points, the hypothalamus stops inhibiting pituitary glands, allowing it to release more hormones. So let's talk about set points first. You can think of this as a thermostat. It's a physiological level or setting that the body attempts to maintain through a self-regulating system. Like a thermostat, above a certain temperature an air conditioner turns on, below a certain amount of hormones increase. They can shift through to the environment. Basically what this is getting at is that our body monitors the levels of hormones circulating in the system. And when the amount of hormones that are being released in the system, in this case specific puberty-related hormones, are low, such as androgens and estrogens. So say your androgens and or estrogen levels are low, what the hypothalamus will do is stop inhibiting the pituitary gland. So aka the hypothalamus stops the pituitary gland from releasing more androgen and estrogen. So again, say your androgen and or estrogen levels are low, your hypothalamus recognizes that and says, oh shit, we need more of these sex hormones, or these puberty-related hormones. Therefore, I'm going to stop preventing the pituitary gland from releasing more of those hormones. Thus, your overall levels of androgens and estrogens increase. And that specific level, that is, you have to, if the hypothalamus is monitoring, if you have not enough androgens or estrogens, there has to be like a level that your body understands, and that is called the set point. So basically it says if your androgens and or estrogens are below that set point, it's time to stop preventing the pituitary gland from releasing those hormones, so then your hormones can reach that nice homeostasis. And that line is called your set point. So again, you can imagine it as like an air conditioner, like 70 degrees. So you have your air conditioner set at 70 degrees. It's now 73 degrees in your house, and boom, your air conditioner turns on to cool it, to get it back to that 70 degree temperature. That 70 degree temperature can be conceptualized as a set point of the air conditioner. So kind of the same idea here. You have a set point of the amount of androgens and or estrogens in your body, and based on the levels of hormones in your body, your hypothalamus will either allow your pituitary gland to release more hormones, or say, hey, no more hormones, you've had enough, I'm going to stop you from doing so. And it's just not these specific hormones, but throughout our body has various set points theoretically. And this is just a visualization of what I was saying before. Some triggers, proposed triggers of puberty include, factors in middle childhood contribute to increased activity of the HPG axis and signals that the body is ready for puberty. Some of those factors include the presence of mature sexual partners, sufficient nutritional resources, and physically healthy enough to begin reproducing. So kind of on the most basic kind of conceptual level, your body recognizes, I have enough nutritional resources to be able to like handle the production of a child if you are a teenage girl, basically. And as well as kind of like, well, this person is capable of giving a delivering a child without theoretically dying. So it's kind of your body's recognition of like, okay, we have now kind of reached some kind of a physical standard, have acquired enough nutritional resources to allow for reproduction, thus kind of like a trigger of puberty on a biological level. Now let's talk about specific brain chemicals involved in triggering puberty, beginning with kisspeptin. It is a brain chemical believed to trigger the onset of puberty. Leptin stimulates the release of kisspeptin, while melatonin suppresses the release of kisspeptin. So basically, you have two chemicals having an impact on kisspeptin. One of them, leptin, stimulating the release of kisspeptin, and melatonin proposed to suppressing the release of kisspeptin. Looking at leptin more specifically, it is a brain chemical produced by the fat cells that may play a role in the onset of puberty through stimulating kisspeptin. So again, as stated before, it is brain chemical, but here we have new information. It is produced by the fat cells, which will be important momentarily. And it's thought to play a role, as stated again, in stimulating kisspeptin, which is thought to trigger the onset of puberty. Versus melatonin is a hormone secreted by the brain that contributes to sleepiness, which is why you can buy melatonin in the store. Granted, sidebar, probably don't do that because, or at least don't do it to treat insomnia, because they're a little hit and miss. It's just a little marketing malfeasance, I should say. Just Google it. Anyway, it triggers, melatonin also triggers the onset of puberty through its impact on kisspeptin. And specifically, that is kind of straightforward here. If melatonin suppresses the release of kisspeptin, and kisspeptin triggers the onset of puberty, theoretically, the less melatonin, the higher likelihood someone will begin puberty, because it's now kind of, there's less melatonin to suppress the release of the hormone that's believed to be contributing a high amount to the onset of puberty. So we have a combination: higher leptin, increasing the likelihood of puberty; lower melatonin, increasing the likelihood of puberty. There are other factors impacting the onset of puberty. Some include kind of genes predispose onset at a certain age. There are more fat cells and more exposure to light trigger puberty earlier. Someone with the same theoretical genes, but who is thin and exposed to less light, will likely undergo puberty later. Puberty typically starts earlier for overweight children and children closer to the equator. Children near equator typically have lower levels of melatonin, thus less suppression of kisspeptin. Artificial lights may impact / accelerate onset of puberty by increasing the suppression of melatonin. So here you can see some environmental factors impacting something even as basic as this universal biological process that is puberty. With children, again, being more likely to experience puberty earlier. I should say children growing up closer to the equator typically are more likely to experience puberty earlier than children living farther away from the equator. Again, because they have less melatonin in their system, and thus less melatonin, aka less suppression of kisspeptin, thus those elevated levels of kisspeptin, those hormones that trigger puberty. So with melatonin in lower levels, that means that puberty is more likely to emerge. And even things like nutrition or something along those lines. It's kind of understood that in very poor areas, not just around the world, but in the United States, there's something called food deserts. This isn't tested on, but wherein there's really just kind of fast food or non-nutritional food, just kind of like fatty foods that really aren't providing a lot of nutritional value for children. So maybe you could say environmental factor of poverty, class, impacting the food you can eat, thus maybe impacting the onset of puberty. And then also, again, we have this historical era impact. This artificial lights, from our laptops, from our screen, phones, TVs, whatever. Obviously, those did not exist 200 years ago. So there's some arguments that this presence of these artificial lights may increase the likelihood of puberty at an earlier age because those lights onset melatonin. That is why people or professionals tell you not to stare at your phone or be super on your laptop, very much engaged right before trying to go to bed, because basically your melatonin levels are going to be elevated, and thus you're going to be less sleepy, and then more likely that you're not going to be able to fall asleep. But in this case here, that decrease in melatonin, allowing for less suppression of kisspeptin, and thus making it more likely to experience puberty at an earlier age. So here you can see all kinds of those environmental factors contributing to puberty, this theoretical universal process. Some ways of how hormones influence adolescence, or other ways I should say, they play an organizing role. Prenatal hormones program the brain to develop in certain and according to certain timeline, like setting an alarm clock. It is sometimes called sleeper effects. Patterns of behavior as a result of this organization may not appear into adolescence. They also serve an activating role, and increases in certain hormones at puberty activates physical changes, such as secondary sex characteristics. Evidence that hormonal shifts may increase adolescents' emotional arousal. So the organizing role point, there are some developmental psychologists who really just focus on prenatal development. They feel that it's a predictor of all kinds of future developmental outcomes. And here we have this idea of programming, wherein exposure to prenatal hormones program certain future biological timelines, or at least are very predictive of, is what they argue. So the idea here is that maybe at a certain age, you're more likely to experience puberty, or more likely to experience stress. So a classic hormone that people look at, prenatal hormones, is stress hormones. So a pregnant mother being very stressed out, it's wide research, and then how that may impact the set points, the programming of fetuses, developing fetuses, hormone levels, and future developmental timeline. So for example, theoretically, super stressed out mothers during pregnancy are more likely to give birth to children who are more reactive to stress, something along those lines. But here, in the absence of stress, maybe more likely to or give birth to a child who's more likely to have puberty earlier or lower. So it's maybe impacting those set points. So you can see the intergenerational transmission of on a biochemical level, really, from mother to child. But obviously the mother also lives in the world, so other people impacting them, the father, their mother, or whatever, their neighborhood, historical era they live in, all those kind of things. Now, interestingly, so what they argue is for something called sleeper effects. So basically what they're saying is the impacts of that prenatal development not really becoming evident to an individual until later on. That could be 12 years old, 30 years old, 40 years old. So kind of like these sleeper effects is literally like in your body, and then they wake up like an alarm clock at a certain period of your time, and then have a positive or negative impact, or kind of a neutral impact on an individual. And then finally, just that activating role. Someone kind of proposed theory is that certain hormone shifts may make adolescents more likely to be or increase the emotional kind of reactivity or arousal levels of adolescents. So it's really not like, oh, they're crazy, they're chaotic, they're reactive, but rather kind of maybe an increase in sensitivity to emotional cues, which we'll talk about far more in detail in later chapters. Moving on to somatic development. Somatic kind of being like physical development. So individuals enter puberty looking like a child. However, within 4 years or so, this now teenager has the physical appearance of a young adult. The average individual grows about 10 inches taller, matures sexually, and develops an adult proportion body. The brain changes in size, structure, and function at puberty. So we really see kind of like rapid changes at kind of a physical appearance standpoint, and then kind of non-physical things that you can't see with the naked eye, unless you're using like brain imaging technology, brain structure, size of the brain, and kind of how the brain functions. It's not just size, but again, we'll talk about that later on. But kind of the big point here is rapid changes are happening, ladies and gentlemen. Which brings us to the growth spurt. And ladies and gentlemen, that is called a segue. A growth spurt, simultaneous release of growth hormones, thyroid hormones, and androgens stimulates rapid gains in weight and height. Adolescent growth spurt is a dramatic increase in height and weight that occurs during puberty. Peak height velocity is the point at which when the adolescent is growing most rapidly. And then epiphysis, the closing end of the bones, which terminates growth after the adolescent growth spurt has been completed. During puberty, boys typically grow around 4 inches a year, while girls typically grow about 3.5 inches a year. And half of adult body weight is gained during adolescence. So, kind of as I said before, this kind of combination of hormones and kind of nutrition contributing to these dramatic growth spurts. And basically the peak height velocity is kind of getting at is that during certain periods of puberty, people grow more rapidly. Here we're talking about growth spurts in height and weight, and that can vary by individual. And this epiphysis kind of point is really just kind of the closing of the ends of bones. This happens early on in life. There's various times throughout life that this happens. But really kind of here, it's kind of representing kind of the ending of kind of like supreme, like super like maximum like growth in height. So kind of like that closing of the bones kind of limits the degree to which you can grow taller in the future. And that process kind of again ends around 4 to 3.5 inches for males and females on average. And again, you can see just a visualization of the growth spurt, and you can see kind of different developmental timing of boys and girls' growth spurts, with girls growing in height quicker than boys. And we'll talk about that later on. Body dissatisfaction. Increases in height is accompanied by increases in weight, which results from an increase in both muscle and fat. Before puberty, boys and girls have relatively few differences in muscle and body fat ratio. At the end of puberty, the muscle fat to fat ratio is about 3 to 1 in boys, and on average, girls' muscle to fat ratio is about 5 to 4. There's rapid gain in fat, I should say, places girls at risk of becoming overly concerned about their weight. Girls are more susceptible to feelings of body dissatisfaction with their bodies are those who mature early and begin dating early. So basically, girls who, as stated, kind of mature early and begin dating early are girls who are most at risk for feelings of body dissatisfaction. Girls who spend more time talking about looks with their friends are teased more often and are pressured to be thin are more at risk of body dissatisfaction. Not super surprising here. Typically, making comparisons to peers is most common form of body comparison. There are racial differences in body type preferences, place certain races on average more at risk. So kind of as stated before, we have kind of these rapid physical changes, which can impact different genders differently. So kind of looking at kind of like a cis normative kind of way we're looking at this here. Girls who have kind of early changes to their bodies are more at risk of feeling body dissatisfaction. One reason because their secondary sex characteristics are more present, or more noticeable to their peers. Thus, they're going to draw more kind of like social attention, which can be damaging in some, at times, not always, but it is a risk factor. And interestingly, a lot of body comparisons, the literature suggests, is that they typically occur from peer-to-peer body comparisons, not necessarily only kind of like this magazine media kind of thing, but rather directly comparing peer-to-peer body images. Now, obviously, those can also be influenced by those kind of like macro cultural factors, but kind of on a daily basis, the interactions are really comparing, girl versus girl. And as stated, there are differences and body type preferences across races, which may impact the risk of certain body dissatisfaction or eating disorders, which we'll cover later on in this chapter. And also, like this, also as a historical era, again, chronosphere, wherein different kind of body preferences change over time, and thus kind of different pressures will emerge, which again can act as risk factors to feelings of body dissatisfaction. Looking at sexual maturation, puberty brings a series of developments associated with sexual development, maturation, I should say. Secondary sex characteristics, we've already talked about puberty, include development of breasts, the growth of facial and body hair, and changes in the voices. Kind of a big one that's noticeable in boys growing up. Tanner, he's a developmental psychologist who proposed sets of stages, that is, systems that describe the 5 stages of puberty development. I'm not going to ask you to memorize these, but I just included them kind of in this slide here and to the next two. Variations in puberty. There is no quote-unquote normal age at which puberty changes are likely to take place. There is no relation between the age at which puberty begins and the rate of pubertal development. Puberty takes between 1.5 to 6 years in girls and 2 to 5 years in boys. Thus, some people will begin puberty before others even begin puberty, which is very fascinating. People can go through a whole stage, basically complete puberty before someone even begins. So thus you can see kind of like rapid differences in body type from middle school to high school, which can kind of impact like kind of social relations among your peers and middle school and high school. There are ethnic differences that exist in the timing and rate of pubertal maturation. On average in the U.S., black females mature first, Mexican American females second, and white females third. Non-white girls may be exposed more often to chemicals pollution that stimulate earlier puberty. So kind of some reasons maybe why some racial differences on average, again, occur. Maybe just your environmental factors. Like we know, for example, that poorer people are more likely to be exposed to like higher rates of pollution. And thus that may impact your kind of your pubertal timing. And we also understand that racial minorities, such as Black Americans, are disproportionately represented in among lower class poor people. Thus, kind of like that combination of class, a lower class, combined with race, maybe contributing to exposure to particular environmental factors, in this case kind of pollution, thus maybe impacting rates of puberty or the timing of your puberty. So again, environment, and obviously that's kind of exposure to pollution and disproportionality of Black Americans and kind of lower classes is rooted in a whole host of historical reasons. Again, related to those macro and chrono kind of systems, those environmental factors. So it's always kind of very important to keep those in mind when talking about difference in just gender or race or sexual orientation, all those things. Because they don't exist in a vacuum. We're all influenced by history. Moving on to genes, environment influences on puberty. Researchers who study variability, another word for that is differences. Variability is kind of our statistical jargon term. Researchers who study variability in onset and timing of puberty use 2 approaches. The first, the study of differences among individuals. So that is why one individual matures earlier / faster than another. And study of differences among groups of adolescents. So why puberty occurs earlier / faster in certain populations than other. So kind of you can look at it kind of on an individual level, or you can compare across particular groups, so maybe racial groups, class groups, disabled groups, for example. And studies point to both genetic and environmental factors in impacting the onset and kind of timing of puberty. Shocking, I know. So let's look at individual differences. Timing and tempo of puberty are largely inherited. That is, it is a genetic predisposition. Chromosome 6, for example, is thought to be involved with this. Genetic predisposition is best thought of as an upper and lower age limit, not a fixed absolute number. Where you fall in the range is affected by the environment, and it's an interaction of nature and nurture. So you can imagine kind of possible your tempo and your timing of puberty, a range of whatever. I'll just make up some number, 8 years, okay? Just making that up. And kind of the idea is that somewhere in that range you're going to fall, but where exactly you'll fall in that range depends on the environment. The factors that you grew up in, so whatever, again, class, class-related stressors, pollution, all kinds of things going on in your world. So kind of you can kind of see, so we kind of have this predisposition that is kind of a range of outcomes, but the environment is kind of contributing to where exactly you'll fall in that developmental range. There are two key environmental influences that exist: nutrition and health. There are others, but here are two we're going to highlight. Puberty occurs earlier among those who are better nourished, who grow consistently through childhood. Delayed puberty is more likely among individuals with a history of protein and or caloric deficiency, and chronic illness and excessive exercise are also linked with delayed puberty. So you can see here kind of the impact of nutrition and kind of the rates of exercise. So, I mean, it's kind of like over-exercising can be detrimental because a child's maybe like isn't biologically capable or like physically fit enough to kind of handle, like if you have them like run a marathon or something. Not that great for like a 10-year-old or like an 8-year-old. It's too much strain on the body. But anyway, you can see here kind of just the impact of nutrition. Again, as we talked about before, very much correlated with like class, race, disability status, all those kind of things, and kind of chronic illness impacting the timing and the tempo of puberty. Familial influences of puberty. Social factors in the home environment may influence the onset of maturation, especially in girls. Early pubertal maturation in girls is related to several factors: father absent families, conflict-ridden household, having a stepfather, sexual abuse, economic stress/class. Tension in the family and stress, which affects hormonal secretion. So kind of here, we can see again kind of environmental impacts the family unit kind of on a child. But also you kind of see these big stressors such as like economic stress, class, conflict-ridden household. Guess what? Conflict is going to be, or certain forms of abuse are going to be more likely in highly stressed out households, aka more likely in poorer households. This is like due to a whole host of reasons. Everybody's stressed out. There's a lack of resources, kind of lack of opportunity to advance in kind of life, and those things all kind of just the weight, wear, and tear kind of wearing you down. And you can see kind of on the right-hand side, I just included a study that from Penn Medicine, which states childhood adversity linked to earlier puberty, premature brain development, and greater mental illness. So here you can see something called childhood adversity, also referred to often as ACEs, that is adverse child events. If you ever want to have a little fun party night, you can Google ACEs and whatever, pick your developmental outcome. So early puberty, homelessness, academic achievement, anything. ACEs in general associated with everything, and all ACEs are in childhood adversity is basically they just ask children or adults really a set of questions basically like were you abused, like physically abused, did you have access to food in the home, were you ever homeless, those kind of things. And basically all they do is add up the total number of how many you had and see if that and of those ACEs you experience, aka how many of those stressors you experience, and then they say then researchers test the correlation between the total number of ACEs with whatever developmental outcome, in this case prenatal, or I should say early puberty. So here we see kind of a correlation, a positive correlation between childhood adversity and earlier puberty. And one kind of maybe theoretical reason, again, is kind of speculation, like all these kind of evolutionary biological theories are, but it's kind of like maybe your body on a biological level being like, well, I'm super stressed out, I'm receiving all these stress hormones, okay, well, I'm literally at risk of like dying. Like there's something in the environment that's impacting me. You know, this is on a biological level. like your body recognizing this and then saying, okay, well, I need to reproduce because I'm going to die really soon. My lifespan is very short. I need to reproduce soon. Therefore, I'm going to have puberty soon or quicker than expected, which then can present a whole host of kind of health risks for a child. Moving on to group differences. These are typically studied by comparing average age of menarche, which is the time of first menstruation. It's not a direct signal of onset of puberty, as full reproductive function does not occur until several years after menarche, but is a convenient measure. Across countries, age at menarche occurs later when malnourished or suffering from chronic disease. The median age range of menarche across African countries is about 14 to 17 years of age. In the United States, is about 12 to 13 and a half years of age. Note wider variability in African countries as there is larger variability in adversity. There's something called a secular trend, the tendency over the past 2 centuries for individuals to be larger in stature and to reach puberty earlier, primarily because of improvements in health and nutrition. So kind of the idea here is that we can compare differences in kind of puberty onset and timing based on menarche. Again, not an exact measure, but it's one that's typically kept track of across history, the one most likely to be at least. And you can kind of compare across countries. So kind of again looking at kind of Africa countries as a whole, kind of the continent of Africa, we kind of have a range from 14 to 7, which is pretty big, like compared to the U.S. age range from 12 to 13 and a half, which is basically demonstrating that the environmental conditions impact the onset of puberty, because there are very rich parts of Africa and then very, very, very poor parts of Africa, and thus that's going to impact the onset of puberty. And kind of one reason why it might is because maybe less nutrition, less health. So kind of like that combination of just, again, kind of not having the biological capability of reproducing, contributing to kind of a later onset of puberty, and in this case, menarche. So really, it's this kind of interesting combination of like higher rates, more likely of like extreme abuse, like trauma, like abuse, being exposed to war, but at the same time, like not having like adequate nutrition. Like when I worked in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which reading kind of the transcripts and working with the women there, I mean, it's devastating. You know, the reporting pregnant women or just women throughout their lives, and guys throughout fathers throughout their lives, kind of eating like dirt, like literally, like bark and stuff from a tree, and they're not doing it. They don't have a preference for doing so. It's just that they have. So like that combination of lack of nutrition, but at the same time having adversity, kind of giving or contributing to kind of differences in puberty timing in like kind of complex ways. Kind of expanding on that secular trend point, in most European countries, maturation is 3 to 4 months earlier every decade. Norway, 175 years ago, the average age of menarche was 17. Today, it's about 12 and a half. Based on reports of European children's choirs, voice crack dropped from around 18 years old in the mid-18th century, that is the 1700s, to 10 today. China, the average age of menarche dropped about 2 years between 1991 and 2011, affected by rates of obesity, that is leptin levels, chemicals, increased exposure to artificial light, the longer a period of time when children have increased risk of sensation-seeking period. So again, you kind of see here, historical era matters even for puberty. You can see here that Norway, for example, as stated, the average age of menarche was 17 versus 12 and a half today. You can also see kind of one way that you can try to measure puberty for boys is kind of this voice cracking, and Europeans are kind of weird and they really kind of obsessed with like boys choirs, but some reports have kind of kept track from like hundreds of years ago of when boys voices begin to crack, and you can compare that to like now, and again you can see kind of radical differences over the last couple hundred years, and in real time you can see that in China as they go through rapid kind of industrialization, so kind of having higher levels of nutrition, having more increased exposure to like again artificial light for theoretically, and all these kind of other things associated with it, maybe pollution, who knows, impacting their rates of menarche. And even the food kind of we eat, you know, and there wasn't like McDonald's 200 years ago. So like kind of that rapid produced fast food, all those kind of controversies with food. That's exists like in the U.S. There's basically different standards for food in European countries. Like there's a lot of food in the U.S. that like exists that like doesn't exist in European countries because they're like, well, there's too many chemicals, like potentially hazardous chemicals there, which don't include that. But in the U.S., a little less. But anyway, so kind of as countries go through industrialization, maybe they're going to have higher rates of like McDonald's, for example, and thus exposed to different like chemicals, which is going to impact rates of puberty. Now, one kind of a behavioral consequence or kind of something to consider is that because puberty occurs earlier, there's basically a longer period of time where kind of the risk factors typically associated with puberty and adolescence is longer because it started earlier. So instead of waiting till you're 17 and going till 25, you're now like whatever, 12, 10 years old to whatever, like 16, 17 years old, and then right, bam, then you're in college, and then more possible risk seeking. So basically, this kind of risk seeking period, kind of traditionally associated with adolescence, it's a little controversial how correct that is, but we'll talk about that later. Is longer because again, this rates of puberty or the onset of puberty occurring earlier now compared to 200 years ago, or in the case of China, even 30 years ago. Now, kind of looking at different ways that you can study puberty. One is cross-sectional studies, and another is longitudinal studies. Cross-sectional studies, a study that compares two or more groups of individuals at one time, versus a longitudinal study, a study that follows the same group of individuals over time. A comparison of early versus late maturers is used when interested in the effects of puberty timing on psychosocial outcomes. So, for example, cross-sectional study, I can have high schoolers who haven't begun puberty yet come into my research lab, and then so that's one group, that is high schoolers who haven't begun puberty yet, and then another group who has begun puberty or maybe even completed puberty come into my research lab, and then I can have them maybe complete some surveys, maybe some tasks, maybe I'm just making up something, mental health outcomes, levels of anxiety, depression, something, self-confidence, stuff like that. So anyway, so I can give them that survey, and I can say, okay, how do these two groups differ? How do those high school students who have not experienced puberty, how do they compare in rates of anxiety to high schoolers who have already completed puberty, and then just compare those rates? So I basically have those high schoolers come into my lab one time, they complete the survey, and I never see them again. They're gone. See ya. Goodbye. One time. Versus a longitudinal study wherein, say for example, I recruit middle schoolers to come to my lab, theoretically before any of them have begun puberty. Not always the case, obviously, but I'm just saying typically. So like sixth graders or something along those lines, and I say, okay, I'm gonna collect data on every middle schooler at this middle school, okay? And not only that, I'm going to follow them throughout their high school career, aka every 6 months, I'm gonna have them come to my lab and complete the same survey. So say in sixth grade, I have the entire middle school come into my lab and complete an anxiety survey. And then every 6 months, I have all the students again complete this same survey, the same anxiety survey. And basically what I can do is track those children throughout their entire high school career and say, okay, so in sixth grade, all these students had more or less the same levels of anxiety, but in 11th grade, certain students had higher levels of anxiety. Why is that? And because I kept track of that data for years of the same people, I can ascertain what are some of the predictors of anxiety. So maybe early puberty, who knows, whatever. But because I have all that data for years, I can follow people throughout time and identify predictors of change within an individual. In most kind of research studies you'll read and probably interact with in our term paper will be cross-sectional. They're much easier and cheaper to run. Immediate effect of puberty. Physical changes of puberty affect self-image, mood, and relationships with parents, whether puberty occurs early or late. Puberty and stress. Modest, but not overwhelming, stress early in life speeds the onset of puberty. Maturing early may be stressful. Proposed reasons for stress increasing likelihood of early puberty are the body recognizing uncertainty in environment, thus needing to procreate quicker. It's difficult to disentangle if the stressors that contributed to early puberty continue and place a child at risk of depression, or if early maturation itself is placing child at a higher risk of developing depression. Going through puberty on time is generally not stressful.
So, as we talked about before with stress and puberty, one proposed reason of why stress may increase the likelihood of early puberty is, again, kind of on a biological level. Your body recognizing, oh, my environment is very dangerous, so therefore I have to procreate at an earlier level, or because I'm gonna die anyway. So like, let's get this show on the road, kind of thing. But however, kind of as stated, that final bullet point is really kind of getting at those stressors that predict the early onset of puberty. It's kind of difficult to disentangle if those stressors that existed prior to puberty are what is causing the child, or most contributing to the child continuing to experience stress during early puberty, or if kind of like the onset of early puberty itself is acting as a stress factor. So kind of the idea here is those early lifetime stressors that impact the likelihood of early puberty are probably going to still exist when you're going through puberty. Like, they just don't magically disappear. You live in a poor environment. It's not like you're not all of a sudden like, ooh, okay, I'm in puberty now I'm rich and I can live somewhere else. It doesn't work like that. You're most likely going to be exposed to similar stressors throughout their life. So thus, it's very difficult to determine if it is the onset of early puberty that's really impacting the child, or if it's those stressors that created or increased the likelihood of early puberty to occur in the first place. Because again, they're still going to be present. It's probably some kind of combination of the two, with early puberty kind of contributing new stressors, while at the same time having those previous stressors, which now also have to deal with the onset of early puberty. So kind of them interacting in complex ways. Puberty and the effects on the brain. Puberty affects the brain in ways that make people more vulnerable to stress. Same stressor have more adverse impact on mental health in adolescent than earlier childhood. Differences in vulnerability/susceptibility to stressors. Puberty makes the brain more malleable, or quote-unquote plastic. It could be good or bad. Plasticity, might have heard of neuroplasticity. It's a capacity of the brain to change in response to experience. So kind of the idea here is that similar stressors can impact people depending on where they are in their life. In the case, one stressor can impact a teenager going through, or an adolescent going through puberty in more severe ways and more consequential negative ways than maybe an older adult, like a 40-year-old, or maybe even a 5-year-old, I don't know, depending on what stressor it is. Kind of one proposed reason is that the brain during puberty is more malleable or plastic. So basically, because again, there's a rapid changes are happening at a physical level and kind of at a neurological level, our brains are quote-unquote plastic. So basically what it means, you can imagine hot plastic, how you can mold it like physically. In this case here, it's the environment kind of molding, shaping our brains. Our environment's literally impacting our brain structure, our brain wiring, and thus making it very malleable, which can be good or bad, depending on kind of like the environment you're experiencing. And due to that kind of elevated sensitivity, that increase in neuroplasticity during puberty, during adolescence, children may be the effects of stress on a child may be more severe during this period. Because again, you're kind of very, very plastic. Thus, the same stressor that occurs to you at 40 years old when you're less plastic is going to impact you more theoretically, kind of a theoretical level, during puberty than it would when you're 40 years old. The impact of puberty on moods. Majority of teenagers do not report large ups and downs in their moods. So for example, daily diary studies, wherein adolescents are asked to keep track of their mood, write in a diary basically every hour, 6 hours every day, depending on the study. What studies have found is that adolescents become less moody as they get older, and those who don't, however, are at higher risk for negative developmental outcomes. Change in mood is not solely due to hormones. Several reviews have found only a weak direct correlation between hormones and mood. The association is stronger early in puberty when rapid changes occur. It suggests fluctuations affect mood, not the overall level. So this is kind of a classic thing where people are like, oh, it's the hormones, kind of thing. Not really. You'll find in developmental psychology, typically, that there's really never really a direct one-to-one correlation where only one thing is affecting a developmental outcome. It doesn't really work like that. Development is far too complex. Again, look at Bronfenbrenner's model, but even in the absence of that model, kind of developmental psychologists understand this. So kind of, again, there is a correlation, but it is weak. It's not like, oh, my hormones have increased, therefore I'm a completely different person now. It does not work like that. Moods are greatly influenced by environmental factors, such as school, family, stress, the time of the school year. There's a strong relationship with family and or self-control, reducing the impact of testosterone on impulsivity. If a child already was stressed during interpersonal reactions, their lives may be at a higher risk during puberty because of increased sensitivity to stressors. Little evidence that adolescence is inherently a time of storm and stress. So basically the final bullet point is, again, environments matter. Your school that you go to, your family, your neighborhood, the country you live in. Are you currently at war? Are you being bombed right now? Are you going to a depression, like an economic depression? The time of the school year impacts students having different moods during different parts of the year. And this is not just on girls, but on boys. Kind of the impact, there's a strong relationship between the quality of the relationship with your family and a child's self-control and impulsivity. So it's not, again, that, oh, testosterone makes children violent, the boys are out of control, they're impulsive, whatever. Again, there's not this one-to-one direct correlation between behaviors. Other things will impact impulsivity, such as, again, if you have a very bad relationship with your family, or you live in a very poor neighborhood, or you have low levels of self-control. And that third bullet point, all I'm really getting at here is, again, as I said before, adolescence, you don't enter like puberty and adolescence and boom, you're this whole new person, wherein like everything that happened before doesn't matter anymore, you're starting fresh. No, it's a lifelong development. I understand that this is an adolescent development course, but our previous development is going to impact our adolescent development. So in children who are already stressed prior to puberty, they're going to be more at risk of being stressed during puberty. And there's very, very little evidence / no evidence that adolescence is inherently this time of storm, stress, where chaos, hormones are raging out of control, you're losing your mind every single day. Not really. That is not a finding. That is a very kind of old kind of way of thinking from like 70 years ago. That is not scientifically supported. That is not the scientific consensus anymore. Moving on to sleep, many teenagers go to bed late in the evening and sleep late in the morning. Delayed phase preference, a pattern of sleep characterized by later sleep and wake times, which usually emerges during puberty. It's caused by an interaction of biology and environmental factors. Melatonin levels, again involved with fatigue, drowsiness, increase about 2 hours later among adolescents who have completed puberty than among those who have not yet begun puberty. Adolescents who have completed puberty wake up with higher levels of melatonin comparatively than adolescents who have not begun or completed puberty. The internet, television, and electronic media, which is a funny way of putting it in the book, I just felt like keeping it because it was funny phrasing, very old person framing, the electronic media. Anyway, going to bed later has increased past 30 years. It provides reasons to stay up, aka FOMO, fear of missing out, and screens may decrease melatonin levels. So kind of we see an impact here, again, of biology and the environment kind of coming together, with biology being that melatonin levels literally shift as you grow older, with your increased levels of melatonin kind of becoming emerging in an individual 2 hours later among adolescents who have completed puberty. So aka, the higher your melatonin, the more likely you are to fall asleep. So if my melatonin levels hit like peak melatonin levels at 8 p.m., okay, well, it's time to go to sleep. However, as an adolescent, oh wait, now my melatonin levels are at peak at 10, 11, 12 p.m. So thus kind of that biological shift impacting my likelihood of going to sleep. But not only that, but because we still have the same school schedule, all children, regardless of puberty level, have to wake up at whatever, 6 a.m., 5:30 a.m., whatever. They have high school at whatever it is, depending on your high school, 7:30, 8 a.m., 7 o'clock, depends on the region, but whatever. In general, because of that, it kind of delayed melatonin, because that your peak occurred, whatever, at 10, 11 p.m., those children are waking up with higher levels of melatonin than children who haven't gone through puberty. So that is children who's completed puberty are waking up with higher levels of melatonin because their melatonin sleep cycle basically started later. So it really takes them a couple hours into school for their melatonin to decrease and kind of get over that drowsiness, which can be a problem. But also we have kind of these chrono factors, these macro factors, the internet, television, all these kind of screens kind of maybe possibly impacting our melatonin levels. We have an understanding that if you're just like staring at your phone, you're TikToking, you're on that FYP, you're now 3 hours deep into that FYP, and you're like, oh wait, it's 11 p.m. I need to go to bed right now. It's like, not really. My mind is like racing. I'm like wide awake because possibly screens may decrease melatonin levels. But also at the same time, you're maybe talking with your friends, maybe they're staying up later, and you're like, yeah, I want to talk to my friends, and I don't want to like lose out on that social experience. So kind of that interconnectivity through the internet may be contributing to changes in sleep patterns. Early school schedules contribute to sleep deprivation. It contributed to calls to change school schedules. Consensus is that teenagers don't get enough sleep. Insufficient sleep places children at risk of depression, obesity, alcohol, drug abuse, self-control problems. Poor children at risk of not getting enough sufficient sleep and trying to catch up on weekends contributes to problems. So kind of the idea here is that we have an understanding that and have a system really that regardless of where you are in puberty, boom, school starts at the same time for everybody else. So then it's like, okay, well, is that really the optimal way about going things? Maybe, maybe not, I don't know. But we do know that there's a consensus that teenagers aren't getting enough sleep. So what do we do about this? So again, you can kind of see here the impact of those macro systems. Again, public policy, school schedules, these things impact developmental outcomes because you're going to arrive in school sleepy, you're more likely to be depressed, drug use, again, delinquency, all these kind of things. And then we also have a class impact wherein poorer students are more likely to get less sleep due to maybe instability in household, instability in the neighborhood around them, hunger, all these kind of things. Impacting sleepiness and thus increasing the likelihood of negative developmental outcomes, not just in high school and middle school, but throughout their lifespan. Puberty in the family. Puberty increases conflict and distance between parents and children, regardless of whether the adolescent is early or late mature. There's a distancing effect. However, this distancing effect is not consistently observed in ethnic minority families. Note, the types of conflict are typically not severe. So we kind of have this thought process of a distance occurring between families during puberty, doesn't matter when it starts, and kind of true in the US, but not always true. There's differences, again, in ethnicity, wherein some racial minorities are less likely to kind of observe this kind of different and increases in conflict. Again, variation, and you can see this across different countries as well, due to a whole host of reasons that we'll talk about later on. And I should note, however, the types of conflicts are typically not severe. They're not like moral, super like ideological questions, generally speaking, but really kind of like chores related, kind of minor bickering kind of thing. And some kind of proposed reasons are physical appearance, so kind of dressing differently, hormones, and psychological functioning of the adolescent. And really for the parent as well. I mean, you've got to keep in mind that a parent is also going through their own developmental changes. They're going from like maybe their early 20s to early 30s to having a child, and now all of a sudden they're in their 40s, 50s, and they're going through middle age and all these other things going on in their life, which is going to impact how their life, you know. So these kind of got these dynamic interacting people within these family systems, and not just immediate family, but you know, depending on race, class, kind of community, can have social relations can be impacted, or extended family, etc. Moving on to specific puberty events, most adolescents react positively to pubertal changes, especially secondary characteristics. Reactions to menarche are less negative than in the past. Again, historical effect. May be attributed to more information provided about menstruation. Girls whose mothers are helpful and matter of fact in their response to daughter's menarche report more positive memories of experience. Girls whose mothers lead them to believe menarche is uncomfortable are more likely to report a less comfortability, I should say. Girls who report being unprepared report more negativity. Less is known about boys' reactions to first ejaculations, usually not discussed by boys or reported to parents. There's a link between cultural views in response to first ejaculation and views of masturbation. So here you can see kind of the environmental impact on kind of like our response to puberty, wherein girls who have not just mothers, but family members, fathers, grandparents, grandmothers, whatever, whoever's directly involved kind of in your life, an important kind of figure in your life, those parents who are helpful and just matter of fact, like, hey, this is what happens, boom, 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 kind of just like listening to it, and what's happening, this is what it is, it ain't that real, like, relax, are more likely to report more positive experiences. However, if you're a parent, you're like, well, this is going to be the worst moment of your life, everything's going to be awful, high school's going to be the worst, well, the child's going to enter kind of that scenario with those expectations and are more likely to kind of undergo a self-fulfilling prophecy wherein they experience those things. And also girls, as stated, who are underprepared for puberty are more likely to report it being negative. So kind of like they're undereducated, they don't really know what to do, and then that's tons of uncertainty. It's stressful. And as stated, kind of boys, way less known because kind of traditionally masculine roles, you really don't talk about these kind of things, really don't share emotional kind of things on a deep level. Again, those are changing, traditional kind of gender expressions changing throughout time, but classically this is like how these things work. So it's not really immediately discussed among boys, a little more embarrassing, not really reported to your parents, and also kind of the how culture views masturbation. Like if you view it as like a sin, oh, you're going to hell, you just masturbated, well, you're going to be less likely to, one, feel good about it, or maybe you're just more or less likely to just, maybe you will feel good about it, and you're just less likely to kind of share that information. Thus, there's kind of less data on it, and we just have a less understanding of kind of the impact developmentally on those specific events in adolescent boys compared to girls. So let's talk about the impact of late development on boys and girls, and beginning with boys. Early maturers feel better about themselves and are more popular. Some studies, however, have found that they have elevated risk of anxiety or depression. Being bullied is associated with higher risk of negative developmental outcomes. It's more embarrassing to pick on when you are larger. Early maturers at higher risk of antisocial. And some proposed reasons are that the early maturers are less likely to be supervised by adults, and they spend more time with other antisocial peers, and they may be more likely to be involved in riskier parts of neighborhoods. Later maturers have higher rates of depression and perceive themselves as less masculine. They're more likely, however, to score higher on rates of intellectual curiosity in social initiative, possibly because they had to develop coping skills. So let's break this down some. As stated earlier, maturers feeling better about themselves, some studies have found. And you can imagine for boys, thinking like classic boy stuff, like, oh, I'm bigger, I'm stronger, I'm cooler, I'm more man-like. So therefore, I'm more popular as well, because I'm popular among boys because I'm like, more athletic, maybe something along those lines. I'm like crushing in sports, and more popular with girls because again I'm more man-like, so I'm more attractive, and again I'm crushing at like sports and stuff, so I'm like kind of cool. However, also some studies have also found that they are at elevated risk of anxiety and depression. So again, you can see kind of contradictory findings, and it gets back to that, hey, it depends point, depending on all these kind of environmental factors. Being bullied, again, for early maturers, I should say, is associated with a higher risk. So going back to that previous point where like, okay, I'm the big guy now, I'm big tough, I'm a man. Well, if you get punked out by your peer, then it's like, oh geez, I'm a man and I'm getting punked out. That does not feel good. You're more likely to feel embarrassed. You really don't have an excuse why you're being picked on because you're so big compared to your peers. So you're gonna that punked out, that relative, or I should say the social perception of getting punked out when you're really big and gone through puberty is different than like when you're a little scrawny guy. Early maturers at a higher risk of antisocial behavior, again, is stated because basically they're more likely to go out, so less supervision from their parents, and also more likely to spend time with other antisocial peers. So in general, we'll talk about this later on, is that adolescents will group up with kind of similar students, and thus antisocial peers who are earlier matures are going to more likely interact with other early matures who are also antisocial, and thus you can have like a multiplier effect where they're at greater risk of engaging in antisocial behavior. And then if you grow up kind of in a poor neighborhood, or at least a neighborhood that's okay, but also there are risky parts of the neighborhood, like more whatever delinquency is going on, early mature is more likely to kind of be out on their own, unsupervised, and thus likely kind of engage in the worst parts of their neighborhood. And then we have this later matures, risk of depression, but interestingly enough, you can see some studies have found that they actually have higher of intellectual curiosity and social initiative and kind of like pro-social behaviors. And this may be because like in the absence of going through puberty and having like this popularity, they've had to figure out how to navigate this kind of social scenario and kind of deal with kind of those traditional gender roles of boys, of not being like masculine enough. Trying to figure out how to adapt to that behaviorally can kind of increase your coping skills and thus maybe help you develop different intellectual curiosity. or I should say different forms of intellectual curiosity, which then is like predictive of later outcomes, of positive later life outcomes. So again, could be positive, could be negative, but we do have like kind of this overarching like boys dominance, physical dominance kind of thing, contributing, people kind of interacting with that kind of larger cultural phenomenon, which again, decreasing through time, but still definitely exists. Moving on to girls. Early maturing girls are at a higher risk of emotional difficulties with peers, depression, anxiety, eating disorders, panic attacks, drug abuse, and school problems. There are racial differences. White and Asian Americans are at higher risk than Hispanic and Black Americans. Believed to be rooted in how girls look different from peers and how the relationships with other adolescents. Depression is correlated with breast development, not pubic development, which suggests a social role. Earlier maturing girls are more likely to hang out with antisocial boys, more popular, at risk of bullying, abuse, and harassment. However, studies have found adverse consequences of early puberty were limited to adolescents from high-risk households. Again, it's not inherently problematic, but an additional risk factor in an unstable environment may place certain children at disproportional risk. For both boys and girls, stressful life events increase the risk of depression and antisocial behavior. Early maturation does not have a large increased risk for non-poor Black girls, for example. So we kind of have this global finding of early maturation being associated with all those negative developmental outcomes. However, we have racial differences, which could be rooted in different preferences and differences in body preferences among races. It could be involved in kind of like extended social support, so extended family, kind of acting as a kind of a protective factor, aka a buffering factor, aka something in your environment that decreases the negative impact of stressor, aka in this case possibly early maturation. So basically having extended family that you can depend on in times of stress to help you navigate them. Maybe that contributing to it, and you can see that also in Hispanic households. And again, just on average. And one proposed reason is because girls, again, they start to physically look different, that is socially noticeable. So for example, this study found that there was not really or I should say, there was no correlation between depression and pubic hair growth versus there was a correlation between depression and breast development. Okay, one is visible, again, because this is kind of socially defined and you're being compared socially between peers. You can see those changes on a physical level versus hair growth. You can't see that, just walking down the street. Also, early maturing girls, as stated before, are more likely to hang out with more popular antisocial boys, which then you're maybe involved in more kind of you're surrounded by kind of more risk factors of a development. So more likely to engage in like early sex, unprotected sex, more likely to be bullied, harassed, sexually harassed due to changes in your body. So kind of like early maturing girls having kind of different social interactions, kind of developing in slightly different environments around more antisocial peers, thus placing them at greater risk of negative outcomes. However, it's important again to keep in mind that these risk factors vary. And some studies have found that early puberty, the risks associated with it were limited primarily to high-risk households. So again, households that are deeply unstable. So maybe poor relationships with your family, growing up in a poor household, more violence in the household, violent neighborhood, the lack of employment opportunities in your neighborhood. So kind of that instability in life acting as like a stress factor, and perhaps kind of the concentration of risk associated with early puberty maturation, I should say, kind of heavily concentrated in those already at-risk groups. So it kind of goes back to what I said before. Those at-risk groups are going to be more at risk and disproportionately negatively affected by these transitions than children who are adolescents who come from more stable, positive, protective environments. So again, not necessarily a one-to-one thing, but you have to keep in mind the developmental context of the what an adolescent is developing in, and that is why poverty, for example, is so associated with negative outcomes, because all these kind of of environmental factors are placing them at risk of all kinds of negative developmental outcomes. Again, it's an increased probability, not necessarily for sure going to happen, but again, it's an increased risk, kind of like a physical health, increased risk. Smoke for 30 years, you're at increased risk of lung cancer. Doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get lung cancer, but you're at higher risk. So kind of same idea here. And kind of we're going to wrap up with obesity and eating disorders. Weight gain sometimes results directly from physical changes of puberty, basal, I should say, metabolism rate, the minimum amount of energy used by the body when resting. It drops drops about 15% during adolescence. Normal weight gain and changes in body composition lead many adolescents to be concerned about weight. So basically the idea here is that the amount of energy you're using, aka the amount of calories you're burning, kind of decreases when you're just kind of chilling. So when you're just kind of, as like an 8-year-old, for example, and you're chilling, not really doing anything, you're burning more energy and calories than someone who's, for example, 14 years old, because due to kind of these changes in, again, this basal metabolism rate, which can cause some adolescents to react negatively to, which we will cover more momentarily. Beginning with obesity, many adolescents have legitimate concerns about being overweight. BMI is a measure of individuals' body fat, the ratio of weight to height, used to gauge overweight and obesity. Nearly 14% of U.S. adolescents are obese, and another 16% are overweight. This is, overweight and being obese is associated with an increased risk of hypertension, high cholesterol, diabetes, and premature death as adolescents. Increases in both industrialized in non-industrialized countries, and the poor, and regardless of the context, are at higher risk. One study of U.S. American adolescents found that only a quarter of adolescents report high levels of physical activity and high fruits and vegetable diets. Study found chronic early adversity is a risk factor for obesity, lower self-control, and self-medication/coping. Increased physical activity is associated with improved academic performance and lower risk of depression. So we kind of have some rates here of obesity and overweight kind of being associated with later life physical outcomes. And we see kind of increases in obesity in both industrialized and non-industrialized countries, which is telling us that something in our environment is contributing to these elevated rates of obesity. Maybe shifts in food, maybe shifts in pollution, pick your favorite theory, some kind of combination of the two. And looking at this kind of adolescent American study, you see that only a quarter report high levels of physical activity and high levels of fruits and vegetables, which can be related to a whole host of things, like school lunch, maybe not providing proper nutrition. Maybe, again, going back to that food desert point, poorer neighborhoods having less foods available. And plus, frankly, hey, if you shop at Whole Foods, it's a lot more expensive than going to shopping at Walmart or Winn-Dixie. I've lived both those lives, and one is significantly more expensive. So again, kind of like a class impact here. And also, obviously, those kind of high-end nutrition stores are less likely to be found in racial minorities, aka Black Americans, who have been historically disenfranchised in communities underinvested in by the federal government, posing these communities at greater risk of obesity. And this is important because physical activity is associated with a whole host of positive outcomes, not dying early, all kinds of positive developmental outcomes, and improved academic performance, lower risk of depression. And again, on the right-hand side, I wanted to give another example of ACEs, or life adverse experiences. So this systematic review article, which basically a systematic review basically looks at all previous studies related to this topic. So it's just like a mega study of combining all kinds of previous data together to kind of give you a conclusion based on all the data found over decades or X amount of years. And what they found, shockingly, traumatic experiences was positively associated with obesity and PTSD. So that is, as traumatic experiences increase, the risk of obesity increases, the risk of PTSD increase. And thus you can see kind of here, again, these kind of at-risk communities being more at risk of developing obesity. At the same time, we're also seeing kind of global shifts in obesity, which is telling us something about food, something about pollution, something about physical activity, maybe elevated increases in office jobs, something going on at like a macro chronal level, because you just don't randomly shift genetically in like 10 years. It doesn't work like that. So something, again, going back to historical era, these matter, and it's impacting kind of our developmental outcomes. Preventing obesity, most of what children eat and drink comes from their homes. However, again, depends. If you have free lunch, I had free lunch growing up. I had free breakfast growing up. Again, from a poor, not the poorest background, but relatively poor background. So I had those. So a lot of my food came from there, from school. Anyway, preventing obesity requires a multifaceted approach. Parents, mass media, food and beverage manufacturers, restaurants, schools, community empowerment. A combination of behavioral modification and weight loss medication is more effective than either component by itself. Fad diets actually increase rather than decrease obesity. So again, you can, because, as I said before, obesity is influenced by all kinds of things, small, like those micro systems, family, but from macro, food, culture, maybe the way we produce and mass industrialization of food, who knows? Those things are macro factors. Thus, you're going to have to take a multifaceted approach, from parents to medias to food, beverages. Don't hold your breath on that, but whatever. Go for it, I guess. Of Coca-Cola being like, I'm going to make a healthy Coke. Okay, we'll see. Schools, communities, and community empowerment, kind of a big one here. You have to have power to be able to demand change in your community, investment in new food, agriculture, and groceries, whatever. That takes community empowerment. And there's actually a study we'll talk about with Native Americans later on, how Native American empowerment is kind of associated with more predictive of more positive outcomes, and community disempowerment is associated with all kinds of risk factors of depression, obesity, drug abuse, etc. This is a common thing. And here we also see that, kind of want to point out that fad diets typically increase the risk of obesity rather than decrease, because it's just purely relying on okay, I'm going to do this on my own. And people really don't operate in that way. You can say you're going to do that on your own, but guess what? You still exist in the same developmental conditions that you did prior to the diet. And yes, sometimes it can work out for you, but in general, it's very difficult to just all of a sudden be like, okay, I'm magically going to change, deal with these stressors in different ways. It's just not that simple, and it's just a matter of just free will and decide to just be healthy one day. It's quite challenging, which again suggests a multifaceted approach is needed. And it's the point for food and beverage manufacturers. I'll just talk about this for momentarily. The amounts of food that are offered in the U.S. are far different. When I lived in the U.K. for years, the amount of food you get served is smaller than what you get from McDonald's or whatever, fast food or a restaurant, whatever. You just get way more food in the U.S., which these big portion sizes may be contributing to higher rates of obesity in the U.S. Now let's move on to different types of eating disorders. Only 1/4 American adolescents are highly satisfied with their bodies. Over 1/2 of adolescent girls consider themselves overweight and have attempted to diet. Disordered eating, mild, moderate, or severe disturbances in eating habits and attitudes. Studies of magazines aimed at women and adolescent girls reveal traditionally clear and consistent messages that women must be slim to be beautiful. Among Hispanic girls in the U.S., those who are more quote-unquote Americanized are more likely to develop disordered eating than those who are less culture-related. It suggests a cultural influence these rates of eating disorders. So we have this pretty high freaking number of people dissatisfied with their bodies, which can be related to kind of media understanding or pushing slim specific kind of body types. But at the same time, I will kind of note here that maybe an alternate argument, or maybe complementary really, is that, hey, they recognize at the same time that a lot of people around them are unhealthy and they're freaking out about it, but they are kind of adolescents and they really don't think in these macro world ways, or the types of agricultural processes have changed. Oh, food deserts exist in my environment. They don't think in these terms. They are thinking purely, in general. Again, I'm being very broad here. Thinking in terms in their immediate environment. They're just oh, I'm very scared about becoming unhealthy. There's a reason why poor people are more likely to die early, for a whole host of reasons, but they are only processing it at this very micro level, which then can negatively be kind of manifested through eating disorders. So it's a personal interpretation of these larger changes going on in the world that they're recognizing on some abstract level, but instead of dealing with that kind of community empowerment kind of thing, they kind of resolving this kind of issue, or at least manifesting this issue through eating disorders, or kind of like interpersonal bullying towards each other and like criticizing other people. So it could be like kind of some kind of recognition of kind of global trends, but at the same time, in the absence of really understanding what to do, in the absence of like an alternative like policy solution, it's just like, well, I can only deal with this on an interpersonal level. So just kind of a little theory there for you. But also we have this last bullet point of Hispanic girls becoming more likely to develop disorder eating the more they quote unquote become Americanized. That is U.S. America, not America, because there's South America, Central America, but I digress. Anyway, so kind of the idea here is that there's something going on in the culture of the U.S. that is impacting, increasing the likelihood of eating disorders being developed. So the more likely, and you see this actually, this finding is actually pretty consistent of us Hispanics, Americans, and also other countries as well. Kind of some combination of values, maybe alongside those combination of values, again, being exposed to like more American food, kind of combining together, along at the same time having those magazines, kind of that thin ideal, those body preferences, all coming together to create some kind of like toxic cocktail of increased likelihood of eating disorders. So very, again, kind of more complex than this one-to-one thing, but just, but again, something is going on. This again suggests some kind of cultural, environmental influence. And we'll talk about some of the most severe and dangerous eating disorders, beginning with anorexia, which is defined as an eating disorder found chiefly among young women, characterized dramatic and severe self-induced weight loss. Nearly 20% of anorexic teenagers inadvertently starve themselves to death. So just a gigantic number, and this just demonstrates how dangerous kind of this mindset, this disorder can be, especially for adolescents. Bulimia, an eating disorder found primarily among young women, characterized by a pattern of binge eating and extreme weight loss measures, including self-induced vomiting. Binge eating disorder is an eating disorder characterized by a pattern of binge eating that is not accompanied by drastic attempts to lose weight. Only 1% of women, however, develop anorexia, and 1.5% of women develop bulimia, and about 3.5% of women develop binge eating disorder. Bulimia and anorexia are 3 times as likely, or as common, I should say, in females as in males. Binge eating is about twice as prevalent among females. So again, you can kind of see the impact of kind of gender socialization here. More kind of like traditionally heavily regulated among males, but even among females. However, even in males, for it's kind of like gym culture, that kind of thing, males being more likely to have like disorders. But in general, they're more likely to kind of take steroids. They'll be at risk for different kind of disorders, but these kind of disorders more concentrated among women. Again, not exclusively women, but more at risk. And as stated, that risk can be fatal. So again, kind of serious and determined, some kind of contributors to the likelihood of developing an eating disorder. Just some visualization here between black and white girls. There depending on the eating disorder, there are cultural differences in the likelihood of the eating disorder developing, which I'll get to momentarily. And you can also kind of see this internationally, where kind of countries less influenced by kind of like U.S. values being less likely to developing specific forms of eating disorders, like Africa, for example. But granted, as U.S. cultural influence expands, they become more at risk. So again, culturally bound. So kind of looking at bulimia and anorexia across different cultures, bulimia appears to be a culturally bound syndrome because rates have increased over time and the age of people have diagnosed with bulimia has gotten lower over the years. So basically I'm getting about cultural bound is kind of like culturally based. There's basically not just eating disorders, but disorders that literally only exist in particular countries, not just in like the West, but there's some disorders literally just found in Japan and nowhere else, due to a whole host of reasons, environmental factors. Again, demonstrating that the environment matters even here. So kind of we're trying to dissect here what is the role of culture. And we see here bulimia believed to be more of a culturally influenced disorder. It's more prevalent in some societies, particularly those within Western influences than others, and it's typically absent in most cultures in the world, especially in cultures where food is not abundant. So kind of difficult to kind of engage in this particular form of eating disorder when there's not food abundant. Again, these can shift through time as kind of the U.S. Kind of cultural hegemony kind of continues to spread and impact these cultural behaviors. But again, historically speaking, in most cultures of the world, not bulimia is not typically found. However, again, and you can see maybe even the countries, I should say, in like I've looked at some African country studies, and you can actually find higher rates of particular eating disorders in the cities than in rural areas. And why is that? Because the cities are probably more likely to be exposed to kind of Western societies, and thus be kind of exposed to maybe risk factors associated with developing particular eating disorders. However, anorexia is a little more complicated. As with bulimia, rates of anorexia have significantly increased over time, and it is absent in many cultures. It is found in cultures that have very little influence, however, and is also manifest differently in some other contexts as well. There's evidence of anorexia in places with relatively less Western influence, such as Caribbean island of Curacao and Iran. In Hong Kong, people diagnosed with anorexia often do not have a fear of weight gain, which is a key symptom in the West. Instead, they may feel they stopped eating because of a lack of appetite or because they feel bloated. Symptoms resembling anorexia have also been noted among ascetics who refused food for religious reasons, and in the 17th and 18th centuries among teenage girls who starved themselves to emulate ascetic medieval saints. This historical record of anorexia, as well as evidence of anorexia in many non-Western contexts, have led some to argue that it is a universal disorder, although it may serve different functions in different places, that is, religious reasons versus weight loss reasons. Overall, some symptoms of anorexia appear universal, but they are still influenced by culture. So anorexia, a little more challenging to dissect here. What aspect of this is culturally bound, which is more kind of universal? We see, again, kind of more likely to be found even in some contexts where there's little Western influence, or like a lesser degree of Western influence. Granted, again, these change through time. And sometimes in cases where anorexia is present, the symptoms associated and the reasoning behind engaging in anorexia can differ. And you can see this through numerous disorders throughout the world. So again, even when I work with depression in the Democratic Republic of Congo, they describe their symptoms and reasons of depression in completely different ways often than Western audiences, which again, kind of even the symptoms and the reasoning behind disorders can vary across culture. So here, it seems to suggest that some symptoms of anorexia do appear universal, but maybe some reasoning for anorexia can vary across cultures. And that's all for this week. Thanks for everyone for listening, and I hope you have a great week. Thank you so much. Bye.